All right, welcome to LongCon. It's great to be back. It's been a few years. I'm sure most of you, are excited to be here, as I am. Today we're going to be talking about SaaS security basics on a shoestring budget. Before we get into that, a bit of background about myself. GlitchWitch, also known as Jade Null, that recently became public, so can no longer get doxxed. Before starting GlitchSecure, I worked at Bishop Fox, helped secure a bunch of other companies you might recognize. Been a hacker for a really long time. As a hacker turned SaaS founder, I've learned security is really fucking hard, especially without a huge budget or team, right? So what can you expect from this talk? We're going to talk about some general info, some quick wins, basic security concepts and information, stuff that hopefully to most people in this room shouldn't be new. We're going to talk about risk and impact, why should you care, when should you care, and some actionable advice, right? So free tools, low-cost tools, vendors, and best practices. Who this talk is for? Mostly for SaaS and software companies, not really for hackers and security pros. So what I'm hoping to get out of this is feedback, right? So as security professionals, if you have feedback on this talk, on general advice we can be giving to the general public, to the SaaS and software companies, I want to hear it. So come and tell me, come and send me an email. Looking for feedback. This is version 0.1. Very much an MVP at this, so get right in. First, we're going to talk about password security. So, password security, there's kind of three concepts we're going to talk about. Concept one, password managers. We should all be familiar with password managers. They secure and store all your passwords in one place. They ensure that you have secure and unique passwords for each account, which is a thing that sadly even IT professionals still aren't doing. Multi-factor, right? So multi-factor is the process of requiring more than one factor of authentication. It protects against account compromise. We're going to talk about leaked passwords, so evaluating whether or not a password's been included in a data breach, and doing this can reduce the account compromise likelihood. So what can you do? Also, you'll notice on the right I've got level of effort, financial cost, and impact. So this is a relatively low effort, relatively low cost, high impact set of things you can do, right? Use a freaking password manager. Hopefully you're doing it. Hopefully your employees are doing it. All of your employees, not just tech people, right? Make sure that they're doing it. Make sure they're not account sharing, right? So make sure as often as possible people have unique accounts. Enable multi-factor by default. If you are building an application or you're in charge of applications, turn it on by default, even if it's just email. Even just having email limits attack surface so much. Obviously, TOTP is better, security keys, WebAuthn, etc. Passkeys being the new hotness. Require it for sensitive actions. So don't just require it for login. If a user is changing their billing information, they're changing their name, they're doing something that they don't do every day, require that extra step. And leaked passwords. There's free APIs out there to check for leaked passwords. You can basically help your users, your end users, by enabling those. Some providers and frameworks also offer this as a built-in support. So Cloudflare has this built-in for free. Laravel has this built-in for free. It's a really, really easy thing to do. Email security. You better all forward this by midnight or else. So this one requires a fair bit more effort, not quite as high impact, but some basic concepts, right? So SPF, that's the Sender Policy Framework. Essentially, it helps prevent phishing and spoofing attacks from your domain, right? This allows you as the domain owner to say which servers can send email on your behalf. We're going to talk about DKIM, so domain keys identified mail. Basically provides an additional layer of security for email communication. Ensures the integrity of messages in their source. And we're going to talk about DMARC. And we're going to talk about a really easy win there in terms of just setting up reporting that most people just don't end up doing, or they do and it just never gets looked at. So on the SPF side, actually go and set an SPF record. Always good to start with the soft fail and rather than the hard fail, so that's the tilde rather than the dash there in your SPF record. It's realistically, if you get this wrong, you're gonna mess up your email deliverability, so take your time, start with the soft fail, start monitoring with DMARC later. Set DKIM, I'm not gonna talk about how to set that up, but look at your providers. Look at Google, Microsoft, AWS, SES, any marketing providers. They're gonna have guides for how to set up DKIM for them, so the configurations will vary. And on the DMARC side, again, We're talking about stuff you can do for free or cheap. There's a free tool called DMARC Digest. Really easy to set up. They'll send you a weekly report of here's all the servers that sent email on your behalf. Here's whether or not they got accepted or not. And having that even weekly is better than nothing, and it gives you sort of a constant check of like what's happening out there. It can also help you monitor these, right? So if you set soft fail, you can see, are people out there spoofing your email? Are they spoofing your company's email? And then you can kind of figure that out beforehand. I feel like I'm blowing through this a little too fast, but we're gonna talk about limiting attack surface. You'll be surprised how many companies, even like 20, 30 employee, like not huge companies, just don't know what's on their network. They don't know what domains are out there. I have so many scoping calls where we go into it and they're like, I didn't know that existed. So a few things you can do. Obviously, if you are the DNS admin, you have access to the DNS records, just go and look at those. Keep an eye on them. Don't just assume that they're not going to change. If you don't have access to that, you can use a third-party tool like Subfinder. We'll get into that. We'll talk about the information first. So port scanning, process of identifying ports, application firewalls, we should all be familiar with, essentially filter and monitor traffic. So, not getting ahead of myself, again, yeah, if you have access to that, keep an eye on things. There's an open source tool called Subfinder. If you're a nerd, set up a cron job. Run that every week. Get an email alert. If you see new subdomains that you're not expecting, figure out where they are. If you see subdomains that shouldn't be there, right? I just had a conversation with a local company recently where they had an old-jira.company.com. You can imagine when that was last patched and how vulnerable that is. Thankfully they knew, but a lot of companies don't know about that stuff like that. So keep an eye on your domains. Port scanning, Nmap, need I say more? Other tools like Naboo, Mass Scanner out there, definitely a little faster, but if you're just scanning your own stuff, a good way to go. And set up a WAF. And don't just turn on Cloudflare and expect it to be secure by default. Spend the time going through their documentation. Spend the time configuring it. Spend the time enabling rules. Make sure your origin IPs are protected. So set the firewall with your provider, whether it's AWS, Google Cloud, Azure. Go into the firewall to only let Cloudflare traffic through, right? And then test that with port scanning, right? Go back to that last one. Another great tool, Cloudflare Access, we use it. Free up to 50 users. You can basically limit internal applications. So say you have a marketing dashboard or you have some sort of internal tool that you're hosting that doesn't need to be on the public web. Throw basically authentication in front of that and prevent external users from accessing it. Talk about source code security. Wish we could just git commit add and fix security all in one commit, but we can't. So we're going to talk about branch protection. We're going to talk about commit signing and dependencies. So branch protection is essentially restrictions you can set up on specific branches within your repository, so whether it's GitHub, GitLab, whatever it may be. This ensures code quality, prevents accidental changes. We're going to talk about commit signing. So many developers don't sign their commits. So many things can be caught with commit signing. Malicious code that you didn't expect. Contractors subcontracting that you didn't expect. Stuff like that. And we're going to talk about effective dependency monitoring and all those annoying dependabot alerts you get and why you should not ignore them. We'll get into that. Yeah. So on branch protections, set up branch protections. So GitHub has a really good guide. GitLab has a really good guide. Don't just set it for, passing tests. Set your Git protections to prevent force pushes. That actually just burned me earlier when I was trying to publish this blog post last minute. I didn't go through the proper process. It stopped me, even as an admin. Require PRs, require tests to pass, require linting, and require code signing, right? So when I talk about code signing, I mean signing your commits specifically. So when you commit something with Git, for example, we don't know who that's coming from. There are ways you can sign either with your SSH key, a GPG key, and you can tell your code repository, whether it's GitHub, GitLab, etc., that that's my key. This code is actually coming from me. I've helped companies who have found commits they didn't expect because a developer's machine was compromised. Even really small companies. They found, again, subcontractors that they weren't expecting. People writing code that had access to it they didn't know about. So that's a really, really easy one of just requiring that. On the dependency side, honestly, Sneak and Dependabot can get you really, really far, as long as you don't ignore them. Sneak and especially, they're free tier. If you configure it right, you configure it to scan only once a day, only on the specific repositories you care about. I think they have about 300 scans per month. It can get you really, really far, right? You can cover a good chunk of repositories with that. And set yourself a weekly or monthly reminder to actually go in and update your dependencies, right? So go in, run npm update, run composer update, run whatever it is, put something in the calendar and say, hey, the third Wednesday, we're gonna go and do this. Don't ignore it, right? Talk a bit about DevOps. So if you wanna get into automation, and this requires a little bit more effort, a little bit more money sometimes, there's lots of SaaS tools. SAST is static application security testing. So it's essentially looking at the code from a holistic approach of, are there bugs there? Are there potential ways of exploitation without actually verifying that? Can help identify and fix those flaws. And also set up logging and error monitoring. So we should all be familiar with that, but you can set up logging and error monitoring both on a back end and a front end. So both browser errors and server errors. We'll talk about those. So on the SaaS side, there's a couple of tools you can check out. SonarQube has a community edition that's totally free. Relatively easy to set up, same with SemGrep, a little bit more complex. And if you have public repositories, GitHub Code Scanning is a free tool that they offer. Obviously a lot of money if you're going on the enterprise side, but if you have public repositories, you can get that for free. You can integrate these into CI and CD, right? And you can combine that with batch protections where you're saying, require these paths, require there to be no specific code that we found or vulnerabilities we found in that way. Logging and error monitoring, right? So if you implement error monitoring both on the back end and the front end, look for JavaScript errors, look for server errors. Keep an eye on those things. Free tools like Sentry.io can get you a really, really long way. There's lots of platform-specific tools that aren't terribly expensive. So we use Flare app because we've built in Laravel. We find a lot of people poking at our stuff here, and we've actually found real flaws before they've been exploited, just keeping an eye on these error logs. Web application security. You can imagine why I'm in web app security, my last name being Null. The amount of database inputs that have not been sanitized in my life, born to be. So we're gonna talk about HSTS and SSL. We should all be familiar with this. It's 2023. If you have unencrypted stuff, stop. Please, just stop. Please. No more to say about that. We're gonna talk about cookies. You should all be familiar with cookies, used to store session information and various preferences for users in their browsers. We're going to talk about session management. On the HSTS and SSL side, modern day SSL is essentially free, even for stuff that's behind a firewall, even stuff on a private network. So for example, we have run Proxmox. It's only available on an internal network, but you can set up certificates on those and still have that internal network connection encrypted, right? You shouldn't be having a bunch of stuff that's got HSTS, but with a self-signed certificate. So look into Let's Encrypt, look into Google Trust Services, look into setting those up for not just your public-facing stuff, but everything internally. Enforcing HSTS is an easy win. Once you've done that, HSTS is essentially a flag that says, this domain should always use SSL. This domain should always use HTTPS. You can set that with a max age minimum of 6 months. Here I've listed a year, and the include subdomains there is sort of an important one of include everything that we own. Ideally, you want to go through and make sure you've actually enabled it first, because you will break stuff if you don't, but it's a good one to have. On the cookie side, we're not going to get too into it, but I'm going to point you to the OWASP session management cheat sheet, and there's specifically their cookie section. Really, really good resource. Work through that. Make sure you're setting cookies with secure flags, setting the path, the domain expiry, HTTP only. Depending on how your application is set up, you might, read the guide is basically what I'm going to point you to on that one. And on session management, ensure timeout and logout actually work. And I'm saying this as a hacker, as a pen tester. Yes, really. Go and click that logout button, replay the session. Free tool like Burp Community Edition. Go and capture that request, log out, replay the request. Even if it's a simple request, you will not believe the amount of applications that it just doesn't work. And nobody looked, because they assume logout should work. It took me to the home page. That token might still be valid. So actually go and test that yourself. Also provide your users a way to sign themselves out, right? So a lot of places don't give you this. It's a really basic thing that goes a really long way, both in terms of reducing customer support, keeping your users secure. So give them control of the sessions, give them alerts of new sessions, right? A simple check of, add a column to the to the user table with IP addresses, with user agents. Simple check, did that change? Send an alert. Just let them know. And talk about rate limiting. So technique of reducing and limiting the amount of traffic and requests that can be sent in a specific period of time. And talk a little bit about IDOR, so insecure direct object reference. It's a vulnerability class allows you to access and manipulate specific data that you might not have authorization for. And talk about injection flaws kind of briefly. The common ones, cross-site scripting, SQL, SSRF. Essentially, we're going to talk about hacking yourself. So on the rate limiting side, implement this on sensitive resources and spend a lot of time actually thinking, what is a sensitive resource? So anything that triggers, another resource. For example, I was talking to a founder earlier last weekend. He runs a Calendly alternative, right? What ended up happening with that? Somebody found the sign-up form didn't actually have rate limiting. What did they end up doing? They went and triggered thousands and thousands of emails to a bunch of things. That started bouncing. Now his whole service is at risk because he can't send emails because his provider blacklisted him, right? So think about that, right? Think about anything that triggers something else. You want to have some sort of rate limiting. Going back to Burp Community, which I mentioned earlier, you can test this with a repeater and intruder on Burp's Community. Free tool. They have a pro version, obviously. A lot of us might already have it. Check that out. Go and try and send 100 requests in 5 seconds. See what you can do. Send that to stuff that triggers emails. Send that to stuff that uses server resources, right? Same thing on IDOR. You can use a tool like Burp Community. You, as somebody who has access to a backend, who has access to the database, has access to the code, you're going to be the best person to actually test this, because you can go and look. How are we checking for things, right? Are we using UIDs? Are we just using a sequential ID? Go and find what other users have those IDs. Log into your application as a test user. Start throwing IDs wherever you see them. Start repeating those requests. On injection flaws, we're not going to talk about it too much, but Blend XSS, there's a tool called Easy XSS. Really simple to set up. I think they've got a free service as well. You can start dropping payloads in every form you can find, right? Again, go and hack yourself. Spend a couple hours. Every form that a user can enter text, drop a payload. If you don't want to set up the infrastructure, a simple script alert one works as well. Keep an eye for that. Free tools like SQL Map can help you test a little bit for SQL injection. Definitely a flaw that we don't see too often in modern day, but it does come up. And then for SSRF, I'm going to point you again to the OWASP cheat sheet on that one. Really, really good documentation there. And lastly, we're going to talk about external security testing. Bit of a hacker's reference there. So this is one that definitely requires more effort, starts to cost a little bit of money, definitely huge impact. Through these three things, have saved hundreds of millions of customer records from getting exposed through stuff like IDOR, through insecure applications. So we're going to talk about stuff you can do for free, and we'll go from there. So kind of three areas we'll talk about: vulnerability scanning, so automated tools to identify known vulnerabilities, for finding misconfigurations, outdated software, really good on networks. We're going to talk about DAS, so similar to SaaS, this is dynamic application security testing. So this is testing the application as it's running, right? Testing those parameters, looking for stuff like business logic flaws, looking for those kind of IDOR flaws, looking for injection, and seeing if we can get responses in real time. And we're going to talk about penetration testing, why you shouldn't cheap out on that. Essentially, pen testing, if you're not familiar, it's getting a trained professional to go and do all that work for you if you have the budget. On the vulnerability scanning side, there's so many free tools out there. You probably don't need to spend a lot of money on this. Greenbone's Community Edition, OpenVAS, used to be called Nuclei, OWASP, provide a really good coverage. And those are tools you can set up. They're free. Other than the cost of the resources, point those at your applications, put them at your networks, set them up in CI/CD, right? DAS, there's a free tool that came out recently called Dastardly from Portswigger, company who made Burp. Essentially, it's a trimmed-down version of their Enterprise Edition scanner. You can find a lot of good stuff. We've tested it. It works really well. Again, put in your CI/CD. Anytime there's a new deploy, go and test. Definitely worth considering spending some cash here, but only if you're dealing with enterprise deals and only if you have that cash. In terms of penetration testing, going back to hack yourself. So the OWASP ASVS, that's the Application Security Verification Standard. It's a giant checklist. Any competent developer should be able to follow 75% of it. You should be able to go through, basically hack yourself, verify those things. And do that before you spend the money, right? You're gonna find stuff that, honestly, penetration testers will find, but you'll get juicier flaws if you go and do it yourself first. On the pen testing side, a bit biased here, but having seen a lot of pen test reports, both from being a pen tester and from the other side, you don't wanna cheap out here. If you're spending $2,000 on a pen test, you're not getting a pen test. You're getting a vulnerability scan. You're getting some free task tools, right? Spend good money here, but only when it makes sense. Lastly, we'll talk about vulnerability reports, right? So we've all gotten those reports. Hey, we found a serious vulnerability. Will you pay me money? No? Okay, I'm not gonna tell you the details, right? The way you can avoid that, that's what's called bug bounty, setting up a vulnerability disclosure policy. This is definitely one where it's worth spending 2 hours of VCSO's time. You can use, actually I'm getting ahead of myself here. What is a VDP? What is vulnerability disclosure policy? So that's essentially a documented set of guidelines for reporting those security vulnerabilities, right? They're defined by you or your organization, and they encourage that responsible reporting. Bug bounty is sort of taking it one step further, incentivizing those reports, providing researchers an opportunity to earn rewards, and then bug bounty, right? So that's what I was talking about, scaremongering for profit. Hey, we found this problem. Give me money or I won't tell you about it. So on the VDP side, a free tool called Disclose.io, Policymaker. You can get a very boilerplate policy out there pretty much immediately. Honestly, I'd spend 2 hours of VCSO's time, a few $100, up to 1,000, just helping get that defined for your organization. Essentially what this does is it sets a scope, sets clear expectations, sets guidelines for you to accept those reports, what those researchers should expect, whether or not you're gonna pay them, which you don't have to, you really don't have to, and gives you sort of a process for dealing with that. On the bug bounty side, definitely requires a little bit of budget. I wouldn't jump into it first thing. Set up a VDP and a process first and get that down before you start considering actually paying out for bugs. There's also a really good blog post, OpenCage's running a security bounty program as a bootstrap business, lessons learned. Ed over there, great guy. He talks about what they did, how much they spent, etc. Amazing resource. And then bug bounty. When you get those people saying, hey, I found this vulnerability, point them to the disclosure policy. Say, cool, here's how you report it, here's what we can expect, here's what we consider a real vulnerability, here's what's gonna happen when you tell us. They demand money before reporting, tell them to screw off. So, I'm gonna leave you with a little bit of homework. Couple of projects you can check out. The minimum viable security product, mvsp.dev. It's a foundational checklist of things you can do to basically be secure. It's not very long, it's not very intensive. Some of the stuff I might disagree with, but it is an open source project, so definitely contributing there. A lot of easy to understand security controls, basic stuff. And you can actually point to that when you're dealing with those enterprise deals, when you're dealing with customers, and say, hey, we follow this standard. And your homework for the week, stop procrastinating on password managers. Please, please stop procrastinating it. Review your email security. Ensure your WAF is actually configured. Go and set up branch protections, dependency management. Start logging, please. Set up a free scanning tool, and then come and talk to us when you're ready. That's about it.